Check. Good evening. This is Brian Lusk. Thank you very much for joining me today. Glad to have you here. We have got a ton of news that has come up in the last few days here that absolutely impacts the war in Ukraine, but is of an international nature. So let's go ahead and run through some of the big stuff here. I don't have stuff pulled up for any of these items. I've just been tracking them overall during this time to see kind of what's going on and keep track of it all. But so I'm going to be telling things from memory and giving you the high level of some things. So let's go ahead and get into it. Start off with Venezuela. This is the big news that's come up in the last few days. Of course, I'm going to go back just a little bit to about a month and a half ago when the United States, actually it's been about 3 months now, 4 months? September, I think, were the first strikes. Drug running boats that were in the Caribbean were being taken out, destroyed by the United States military. This caused a lot of controversy initially because there were reports that that Hegseth had actually ordered a double tap strike on the survivors of one of the boats. So he's denied it. There's been a lot of back and forth on it. Long story short, drug running, like small, like speed boats, have been targeted heavily by the U.S. military in the Caribbean for the last several months. Then, in just the last month, the United States started seizing sanctioned oil tankers that were leaving Venezuela with the sanctioned oil. And these were, of course, Russian Shadow Fleet ships primarily. In fact, one of them started running away from the U.S. military. And last I heard, they had painted a Russian flag on the boat. The Russians had actually added them to their registry. Now, understand that these sanctioned tankers were generally ones that had invalid registrations. And now the Russians have actually added that particular ship to their registry to basically bring it under their protection in theory. The United States could still stop it because at the time that they began this pursuit, the ship was considered to have an invalid registry. But that's a lot of things going on in that area. Then we move forward to just the last couple of days. Just 2 nights ago, middle of the night, the United States did a sudden raid on Caracas, Venezuela. They captured Maduro and his wife and brought him back to the United States. Meanwhile, they destroyed, I believe it was the tomb of Hugo Chavez, and they disabled somehow the air defenses around Caracas and around Venezuela in general. A lot of theories on that. I'm going to go over some of that in a bit here. But Maduro has had an arrest warrant in the United States for drug charges for years now. There's even been large cash rewards for his kill or capture. So they've grabbed Maduro, they've grabbed his wife, they've taken him out of Venezuela. Now, initially, people were like, well, yeah, the Maduro had falsified the results of the last several elections. There's a democratically elected government in exile that should be able to swoop right in. But the United States has announced they're expecting the current vice president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, to take over and to play ball with the United States. So effectively, you end up with no real change in the government there. Donald Trump has stated publicly that America will run the place until a peaceful transfer of power. But there's a lot of things that are still in flux as far as what's going on in Venezuela. So why does it matter to Ukraine and the Ukraine war? Well, a couple of reasons. Several reasons, actually. Number one, the Russian propagandists and the Chinese propagandists had been talking real big about how their air defenses were in place to protect Venezuela, and Caracas in particular, from the attack. They were ready. They had all these fancy air defense systems. Now, some of them are reportedly S-300s, which are very old air defense systems from Russia. But the long story short of it was there's also supposed to be modern Chinese radar, modern Russian radar, modern air defense systems, manpads, all these things. And yet the U.S. waltzed right in with, I've heard two different reports. One of them says Chinook helicopters, and others say Blackhawks. Whatever helicopter it is, the United States just waltzed right in there with their helicopters, landed next to Maduro's bunker, and picked him right up with his wife and speared him out of the country. No shots fired. Correction. One helicopter received some kind of damage. Nobody has been able to identify what caused the damage, but it also extracted safely with no issues. There's a lot of whys of this happening, but we're talking about a heavily defended airspace where nothing happened, while the U.S. just traipsed right in and did their business. In fact, two news organizations actually had advance warning of this attack, and they refused to publish in order to protect American soldiers' lives. Good news for us. But this is literally, we traipsed in right in the middle of Russian and Chinese air defenses, no problems, did our business, and left with nary a shot fired. That's the type of attack that the Russians wish they could have done at Hostomel back in 2022. In fact, that was their intention, was to land at Hostomel, to quickly sweep into Kyiv, and to decapitate the government aggressively so that their troops could march right into the town and parade all over the place. This puts China and Russia on big notice that their vaunted best systems were defeated by the United States. How? I don't know. They're not talking about that part yet, but I can tell you a few things. It appears, at least from the outside, that the vice president of Venezuela was told to play ball or else. And so she might have been involved in giving a stand-down order, sending those air defense crews to vacation, anything like that. Also, there was a CIA presence in advance, in fact, for months in advance, where they were actually checking things out, feeling things out, had actually set up a fake of the bunker that Maduro stayed in. They tracked Maduro himself and checked his patterns and everything else like that. This was a planned and well-planned and well-executed raid that renditioned Maduro back to the United States to face these charges. Now, the charges themselves are pretty interesting. They've got some obvious ones of drug-related charges. Some of them are firearm charges, basically using illegal automatic weapons, that type of thing. So I don't know what's going to happen there. I don't think there's any chance that Maduro is walking out of there free and clear. But either way, we're still talking about a country that Russian propagandists swore up and down they were going to make a bloodbath for American troops if they entered. Nothing. And it shows that Russia cannot exercise their will across the world. They are not a world power. At best, they're a regional power. And that's only as far as their militaries can actually reach. On top of that, China has got to be on the alert now because their best stuff, or at least the stuff they were willing to sell to Venezuela, was defeated right away. So, what is there to make of that? I think there's a combination here. Maybe political, intelligence, high-tech espionage, technological jamming, bunches of things that probably came together to create this situation. But Russia and China are now on notice that their best, or at least the ones they're willing to put out there, aren't a match to the U.S. when the U.S. is determined to do something about it. Interesting overall situation. That's one more, now from the real deal here, that's one more ally of Russia that has been removed from the board effectively. And some of the Russian propagandists have said that if Venezuela falls, the Russian economy is going to fall as well. There you go. That's the tie-in right there. Now, the next big thing that's come about is Iran. Protesters, actually, let me give you the kind of the quick summary of the back and forth here. The currency collapsed in Iran, the rial, I believe it is called. And so shopkeepers took up and began protesting. And shortly after that, college students joined in. Then the general public has begun to join in, all protesting in the streets. And this is spread pretty close to throughout the country. At least most of 2/3 of the western part have been caught up in these protests. In fact, Khamenei has actually fled the country, last I heard. Belarus actually sent security forces to assist the government there in trying to regain control. And as of the latest information I have is that security forces are now shooting at protesters. In fact, they're even going into hospitals to find protesters that were injured in these attacks and arrest or kill them. In some areas, the local police forces are joining the protesters against the military. Overall, this looks like it's a dynamic situation, but look at this. This is another Russian ally that could potentially fall within days. I'm not saying they will. The brutal crackdown is going to be what determines whether they come out of that or not. Overall, though, this is just another Russian ally that's been knocked off their position. They were still providing drone parts and technical advisors, assistance in evading sanctions and things like that. Now that route is, at least for the moment, blocked. By the way, glad to have you. Let's try that in English. Al, glad to have you here. I'm glad to see you on board. I do see that somebody had posted that probably that my microphone was muted, so I do appreciate that, and I appreciate the assistance on that. Let's see. Robbie, there you are. I was just about to go and because my back office here doesn't show me the names; it shows me usernames, and so I'm sitting here going, I know the username. I know the username. Glad to have you on board, Robbie. As always, happy to have you here. Lots of things going on, let me tell you. So next thing that's happening, China and Taiwan. China is performing naval exercises surrounding Taiwan, simulating a blockade. It's not actually a blockade, but it simulates it. And the United States is watching this. In fact, as the Venezuelan raid happened during this operation by the Chinese. This indicates that China is trying to set up the situation where when it's just right, they can basically surround Taiwan, blockade it without really any external interference. Japan's getting really on edge about China. In fact, China even had one of their jets come over and do a weapons lock on one of the Japanese jets. And there has been no end of feathers flying about that. In addition, though, here's what really caught my attention. China has been building towns and manufacturing facilities across the border in Russia. in areas that were historically Chinese territories. The street signs are in Chinese. The government are in Chinese. The language spoken is Chinese. It's like they're enveloping Russia while Vladimir Putin is too busy looking the other way. So interesting to see, and I've seen that from multiple sources now. I believe that to be accurate from everything I've seen. So amazing information there. Will China, though, be distracted by enveloping bits of Russia enough to stay away from Taiwan? Is Taiwan the distraction that keeps Vladimir Putin not paying attention while they do these things? I don't know. I know that right now Vladimir Putin is basically letting anybody in that will provide workers for his ailing economy. They are in desperate need of additional workers. And of course, where the additional workers come in, there's always the invitation to join the Russian military. Next item, and I'm still in the international stuff right here. Finnish authorities have boarded and confiscated a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker by the name of the Fitberg. It sailed out of Russia and then dragged its anchor across 5 Finnish telecommunications lines, severing them. They boarded the ship and brought it into a Finnish port, and the investigation is ongoing. So Russia is absolutely working on their hybrid warfare attempts. They want to keep the European Union from really uniting, but I think they're going to find that this is backfiring in the long term. We'll see. And finally, in a kind of a surprise addition here, Syria, which had been basically the government overthrown by al-Jolani and all of his questionable people there. British and French air forces struck an underground facility of the Islamic State near Palmyra, Syria, on January 3rd. I've not been able to get what exactly was struck or a damage assessment. The interesting part, though, is the British and French were acting together independently of NATO or the United States. Interesting to see, and it could mean that Europe is finally taking a serious look at what their own defense is going to require. The time in the saddle, trying to make sure they're striking targets, is an important part of making sure your military is ready to respond if anything goes horribly awry. And that's the big news on the international front there. That was a lot to burn through. And so much more to go through. Over the last month, we have had Kupiansk fall to Russia and then be retaken by Ukraine. We had Huliaipole. I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher the pronunciations today. Huliaipole. The Russians actually captured a nearly intact command post in Huliaipole, and they put out videos showing the command post and some of the captured equipment and things like cell phones that were left unlocked and things like that. And yet, shortly after that, the Ukrainians did a counterattack and went right back in. And as I understand it, there's now heavy fighting in Huliaipole. I also understand, and this is just from general information I've seen, that the command of that entire area there was removed because apparently they'd been sending in reports that positions were manned, that things were defended, but nobody was in those positions. Fake reports, the same type of thing we see out of the Russian military all the time. So let's go ahead and get in here. Let's switch so I'm in the bottom right corner here, high from the bottom right corner of the screen. So Kupiansk. This is the big surprise out of this whole area right here. The Russians had been claiming they'd taken Kupiansk, that they were holding the whole thing. They never actually held the whole area. And all of a sudden, Ukraine flooded in, kicked them out of Kupiansk. Absolutely, there's maybe 100 or so Russians still on the edges of the city here. But this was a major counterattack. They destroyed many Russians. They cut off their main supply routes into the city, and everything in this area just literally, the Russians were like, yeah, we've got this. In fact, Vladimir Putin himself has said that they hold Kupiansk. and yet Ukraine within days was kicking them right back out. This is just a highly successful counterattack that was carried out, and the Ukrainians are now pretty well entrenched inside Kupiansk itself. As Andrew Perpetua says, the main threat in Kupiansk is largely neutralized. The surrounding region still faces several imminent threats. Russia's general, Gerasimov, which I don't think is Gerasimov himself. Okay, hold on a second. Never mind. This is incorrect information. The update is here. However, this is just another source indicating that the Ukrainians had gone back in and kicked the Russians right back out of Kupiansk. Then there was, this actually happened just today, a strike on a hospital in Kupiansk. And the Russians were like, ha, 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 those Ukrainians, they struck their own people in this Kupiansk hospital. Actually, it was Russian occupiers holding the hospital. So they were destroyed by Ukrainian forces there. And fewer than 100 Russian troops remain in Kupiansk and Kharkiv, according to a joint forces spokesperson, Viktor Tregobov. There we go. The clearing operation is nearing completion, with remaining Russians mostly hiding in basements in the city's central and northwestern areas. And this is kind of the overall map of the area. This is Ukraine's counterattack, pushing the Russians back. The Russians managed to get through Liman Pershi pretty fast, and through Sinkivka. These areas kind of fell kind of like dominoes in a hurry. But Kupiansk itself, they thought they had it. Now they've been kicked out. So let's talk about the Huliaipole command post here. This is from December 25th. Russian troops overran a TDF battalion command post when they left behind maps, documents, devices, and seals, indicating a severe breakdown in command and control. This turned Huliaipole into a gray zone with urgent action needed. Just the next day, the assault groups of the 425th Assault Regiment Skilya have entered Huliaipole with active clearing operations underway. And then Chuck Farrer reports that the situation remains difficult, with Russian numerical superiority still in the area, but they are still counterattacking and pushing back in the area. There is no indications of an immediate collapse, but prolonged fighting is likely to continue in this area and something to watch. It depends a great deal on exactly how many resources Ukraine is willing to invest in pushing the Russians back out of here. They may decide that they are just going to pull back from this one and trade some distance for lives. Odessa took a major missile strike just early in the month, actually, on port infrastructure and the city and civilians. It was a pretty bad one, actually. And every time the Russians get basically denied on the main battlefield, they launch a whole bunch of stuff at Odessa. On top of that, the port strikes hit the two ports and damaged 3 commercial vessels in the port, all of them owned by companies based in Turkey. And this is right after a phone call between Turkish President Erdogan and Russia's Vladimir Putin. So clearly that diplomacy is not exactly saving the Turkish people any money here. The Russians are going to deny them no matter what. Another piece of big news that came out back on the 15th. This is footage from the naval port of Novorossiysk in Russia. Let me give you the high level on this. That explosion was right behind a Kilo-class submarine. Now let me tell you what's going on. I'm going to give you the high level on this one. This strike occurred. The next day, 3 other Kilo-class submarines were evacuated from this base, and others were moved around. They sunk some blocking ships into the mouth of the harbor so that only surface vessels could pass over. What had happened is Ukraine had snuck an underwater sea drone into the bay and attacked this Kilo-class submarine at port. The reports are they did not directly strike it. The The blast and the later damage does show that. But one thing that's interesting, like I said, 3 other Kilo class submarines were moved. This one is still in position in the same spot that it was when the attack took place. It was actually moved forward a few feet, which indicates it is screwed. It's in bad shape. It's not able to move. This is a real coup for Ukraine. They snuck a naval drone, a undersea drone, all the way into Novorossiysk harbor and carried out a mostly successful attack. And on top of that, the footage that they have is from Russia's own security cameras. So they just let the Russians provide the data for it too. The after-action reviews were quite impressive. Overall, though, this shows that in the Black Sea, Russia has effectively been denied the use of it by a nation with no significant surface vessel navy. They are entirely carrying out their attacks with drones, both surface and undersea drones. And they have effectively chased Russia out of the Black Sea. Any vessel that emerges from Novorossiysk is subject to attack, being chased down and either chased back in or heavily damaged or even destroyed. This is how they're keeping them at bay there. That said, a lot of their missile-carrying vessels are just firing their missiles from Novorossiysk Bay itself. So, it's more to be watching there. Here's the damage from that attack there. You can see the submarine still in position there, and the damage to the corner of the port. Other vessels were moved from this area. Again, this indicates that vessel got damaged badly enough that it's no longer able to be moved under its own power. The surprise to me is that I'm surprised Russia didn't tow it out of there just to say that it could still move. That's what surprises me. But they actually put out a video showing the vessel still in position in the harbor. It showed a significant list with this video. And there's a possibility in this picture that this is an oil slick or other material from the sub, or it could be smoke. We're not sure exactly what that is. So that was an interesting and bold attack by Ukraine. But that's not all. A Ukrainian drone attacked a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker in the Mediterranean Sea. This is quite interesting, and it's be interesting to find out how they pulled this off. I have my theories. My theories are basically that they just, snuck one out of the country, took it to a willing or unwitting partner who allowed them to launch it from there to strike this Shadow Fleet tanker. Now, the interesting thing is they focused on the on-deck hardware, which makes it hard for the vessel to bring on cargo or discharge cargo, or to do a transfer at sea, which a lot of these shadow tankers are used for. There was also some reports that there were some pretty high-ranking Russian officials on this particular vessel. I've not had any confirmations of that. I've seen it in several places, but nobody's given me a good, solid confirmation. I'm putting it out there as something that may be true, but I cannot confirm. And over in the Caspian Sea, long-range drones from Ukraine struck this oil platform in the Caspian Sea, with at least 4 actually managed to strike. The oil and gas production was halted. This was on December 11th. I have not seen good information since then, but that's still another amazing show of Ukraine's getting their distance in on their drones. Now let's talk about peace negotiations. This has been an entirely crazy set of circumstances here. There have been moments of highs and lows and sudden changes. In fact, during this, I know I don't have anything in here about this, but right before Trump came in to basically have some chats with the Ukrainians over in Florida, Vladimir Putin had a phone call with him and told Donald Trump that, the Ukrainians had struck my house. They tried to damage my home. One of the 4 palaces that he uses, of course. And number one, it's a valid target. Vladimir Putin is a valid target. But on top of that, Ukraine has denied it all outright. And Russia said, we don't have to provide you any proof. You're just going to have to take our word for it. Then they got a perfect, pristine controller board from a drone and handed it over to the United States and said, see, here's the data in this controller right here that shows that this was targeted at Vladimir Putin's house. And that's kind of the long story short on that. So the Donald Trump, when he heard this from Vladimir Putin, this is right to literally immediately after his phone call with Putin and during the press conference with Zelensky, he said that he didn't like that this had happened. And then he finally said, well, maybe it didn't happen. I don't know. But Vladimir Putin said it did. But still, negotiations continued. We have now heard from the U.S. side that they are ready to give us security guarantees that correspond to Article 5. Take your choice on whether you believe that's a reliable guarantee at this point in time. The Ukrainians directly rejected Russia's demand for capitulation at the UN with a deliberately chosen Russian language taunt during remarks to the Russian delegation. Our territory and our sovereignty are not for sale. We are not at the Christmas bazaar. We are not at the infamous Cherkasovsky market. You will get the whole from the bagel, which apparently is a Russian phrase. And obviously, we all know that when you get the whole from the bagel, there's nothing in there but air. Kind of an interesting turn of phrase. But continued along with the Kremlin basically setting up the information conditions to reject any meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine. And they've continued to threaten Europe, and they've continued to say, and we'll accept peace on our terms only. And that's where things are there. Between the Ukrainians and the United States, though, the negotiations continue to pace. They've got some documents 100% ready. Others 90% ready. There are some sticking points, most of them territory related. But these documents are formulated in a way that does not violate the foundations of Ukraine's constitutional system and its sovereignty, according to Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister, Serhiy Kislitsia. Zelensky did see, now they're kind of hopping forward a bit, Zelensky did see about the raid on Venezuela and said, what can I say here? If this can be done to dictators like that, then the United States of America know what they should do next. Wink, wink. However, Ukraine is continuing to prepare for 2 possible paths, diplomacy or continued defense, if partner pressure on Russia proves insufficient. So they're preparing for both possibilities overall. Zelensky did state that the presence of British and French troops in Ukraine is essential for security guarantees. This is part of the overall guarantees that he says are needed in order to prevent Russia from basically just jumping right back onto it. And to be honest, I think that's true, because Russia is, if they sign something, the odds are good that Russia is going to say that, oh no, Ukraine attacked us again. We must start the war again. And of course, depends on, will the U.S. just believe them? That's a good question. We don't know for sure. So having third parties there that can say, no, is a vital part of making sure that whatever deal comes out of this has a chance of succeeding. Ukraine and the United States have finalized a military agreement consisting of 4 sections and annexes covering support, logistics, recovery, modernization of the armed forces, and monitoring mechanisms. They also confirmed it outlines potential responses to potential violations. They're also developing the same type of agreements with their other partners, including coalition deployment matters. Overall, this means that the negotiations are going along. The impression I get is that the Ukrainians are maybe not pleased, but at least not entirely dissatisfied with the results. President Zelensky did announce a series of changes in top brass across the government there. There will be rotations for everyone, he said, confirming that changes have already begun with the cabinet. Robbie, yeah, you have a great day. Thank you very much for jumping in. I'm going to try and get through the rest of this before too long, but you have a great day, and we'll see you on later on, okay? There'll be rotations for everyone, said President Zelensky, confirming changes that already begun with the cabinet and will expand to the ministries, the SBU, and eventually armed forces. Some have been in place too long. It's time for renewal. This is actually a good idea overall to keep people from getting complacent or potentially complacent for other reasons. Shake up things a little bit to get some fresh blood and some fresh thought. It's always a good idea to keep an eye on what's going on. Now, if you're winning 100% and totally running the enemy out, then this wouldn't be going on. But overall, the situation with Ukraine appears to be in that situation where, as things are going on, they've had many of these people in place for years now. Some of these people need a break, a change of pace. One of those people actually is Budanov. And he's actually was speaking about, just back on December 6th, speaking about the talks between the United States and Russia and Ukraine. He said, everything is fine. Don't rush. All negotiations must happen in the shadows. Otherwise, they won't succeed. You don't want us to blow them, do you? Which kind of sets the tone for this next one here. Zelensky met with Kirill Budanov and offered him the role of the head of the office of the president of Ukraine. Now, this is after Andrei Yermak was displaced due to some various corruption potential right there. A lot of things going on with that. I don't have good information on it. I just know it happened. And Budanov has been tapped to take Yermak's place. Now, Yermak had been Zelensky's right-hand man for, I think, over a decade and a half, is my understanding. Budanov had been in basically the spy business for a very long time, but he's also expanded his repertoire outside of basic spy work. And by basic, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek. The man has skills, is what I'm trying to say. And if you're trying to make sure that you are on top of everything going on in your nation, who better to fill that role? Also, it may be positioning Budanov for future political aspirations. I don't know that. Theorizing. Budanov did confirm that he had accepted the proposal and will continue to serve Ukraine. He says the position of head of the office of the president of Ukraine is another line of responsibility before the state. It is both an honor and a profound commitment, especially at this decisive moment in our country's history, to focus on issues critical to Ukraine's strategic security. I am grateful for the trust. I extend my sincere gratitude to my fellow service members and to the entire DIU team for our work. We will continue to do what must be done to strike the enemy, defend Ukraine, and work tirelessly toward a just peace. Together, we will continue to fight for a free and secure future for Ukraine. Zelensky also supported appointing Denis Shmyhal as First Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Energy, urging parliamentarians to back the decision. He's currently the Minister of Defense and is set to be replaced by Mikhailo Fedorov. In addition, they did state that at this point in time, Alexander Syrski, who is the commander-in-chief, is not under consideration for rotation. Now, some people think that there are better options than Syrski. I don't have an opinion on the matter. This does indicate that there is some consistency, at least in this aspect of the operation, for this point in time. Here's Mikhailo Fedorov, who's going to become the new Minister of Defense. Dude, this guy is young. He looks like he could be my son. That's how young he looks. Now, my sons are adults now, but still. He looks like, yeah. But he's been the Minister of Digital Transformation. He could bring some new skills to the defense ministry that may mark great changes for the Ministry of Defense. Interesting to see. Interesting to see. All right, the news out of Ukraine itself. This is from today. There were blackouts in Kyiv itself, with blackouts in most districts. The city is in darkness from the Russian strikes. Emergency and planned power outages have been introduced. Many shops, pharmacies work from generators. This is the continuing pattern. The Russians strike energy infrastructure. The Ukrainians fix it the next day. And then the Russians try and strike it again. A car exploded in Kyiv's Obolon district, wounding a serviceman with shrapnel, according to prosecutors. They did have the full response to it, and it's being currently investigated as a terrorist attack. It would not surprise me to find that the Russians are currently operating these types of sabotage and attack teams in Kyiv itself. Something to watch. Ukraine now produces over 200 FP1 or FP2 long-range strike drones per day at about 58 grand per, significantly cheaper than Russian Shaheeds. This means that they're basically winning the war of attrition in this regard. This I thought was interesting. Ukrainian drone maker Firepoint has localized 97% of engine production for its long-range drones. 80 of the 82 parts are made in-house from casting to final assembly. This is amazing. It means that they're not reliant on foreign donors for most of this work. Tremendous local work to arm itself in the ongoing fight. There was a strike on Kharkiv itself again. The local mayor says at least 5 have been killed by this attack. There was really no military target there. This is all residential stuff. Normal actions by Russia. This is a fun story right here. Oh, I can't even tell you. The head of the Russian Volunteer Corps, Denis Kapustin, had a $500,000 bounty on his head from Russia. So the Ukrainians sent the Russians a video showing Kapustin entering a minivan and a drone attacking the minivan, and then showing the destruction of the minivan itself. Presumably with Kapustin inside. They sent those videos off to Russia. Russia said, "Doggone it, you got him. Great job. Here's your $500,000." A few days later, the Ukrainians said, "Oh, look at this. Here's Kapustin right here. Dennis, good to see you, buddy. Glad to have you here. Looks like Russia just paid us 500 grand to keep doing operations against them." It's fun. It's a fun action that Ukraine pulled off here. And I hate to say that in the context of war. But it's creative. It's interesting. It makes the Russians pay, and Ukraine's out probably a beat up old minivan. Interesting. Moving over to the news out of Russia itself. Retired Russian General Vladimir Churkin made a series of admissions blaming Russia's intelligence community and admitting that his country was grossly unprepared for this war. They thought that 70% of Ukraine's population was supportive of Russia, and only 30% were against them. And it was, again, really opposite. In fact, I think those numbers have gotten even worse as far as Russia is concerned. So when they went into Hostomel, they expected no resistance. When they marched basically interior forces towards Kyiv with their parade uniforms in the back, they expected to be greeted as liberators. So they were wildly unprepared for the invasion that they launched. Of course, 3.5 years later, it's a lot going on there. From Estrella, "I am Russian," she says. "I know Russian political and military doctrine better than any of your Afghanistan counterinsurgency experts. The ethnic cleansing of the occupied territories in the event of a ceasefire is not just theoretical, it is certain." She continued, "I will not surrender 5 million Ukrainian civilians to such fate." But Vladimir Putin has already formalized the Russification of the area. By Russification, they mean killing anybody that they don't like, meaning Ukrainians, deporting anyone that is still compliant enough to Siberia, and then putting Russians in. That is Russia's way. Russian telegram channels report a strike on the Energia plant in Lipetsk. This is a key supplier of batteries, lithium-ion batteries, as I understand, and other pieces of missile equipment. And, of course, it's a Western-sanctioned plant. About 200 flights were postponed in Moscow today due to a drone attack in the Moscow region. This is very expensive for Russia every time it happens. Here's that message I mentioned earlier about Venezuela. Oleg Deripaska, which is a Russian billionaire, said if the U.S. gains control over Venezuela's oil production, the Russian budget will face problems. And as I said, as of 2 days ago, America apparently has at least tacit control over Venezuela, at least for now. A new modification of Shahed drones are now fitted with Igla man pads so that the drone can basically defend itself from interception. Of course, their interceptors are really cheap now, so you're firing an expensive man pads at a cheap interceptor drone, and then, of course, the next interceptor drone kills the Shahed. A lot of the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed they shot down 253 Ukrainian drones over 14 regions last night. Again, Ukraine is flooding the zone near Moscow, making Russia fire off expensive air defense assets. If they can get to where Russia doesn't have enough, they can then do the real attacks on military targets in Moscow. Energia plant again, just so you can see that there was a good strike. Blackout in Kursk after Ukrainian drones struck a power facility. Drones struck the Tamanneftagaz oil terminal in Krasnodar region, damaging key infrastructure. They do have enough pictures, visible to show that it's out of operation at least. Another one about Venezuela again. Putin invested heavily in Venezuela. They're not getting that money back if America takes over. Just saying. And final thing out of Russia itself. Vladimir Putin made an address on New Year's Eve. But people who were watching the video noted there were changes in the color of the tie and other weird changes in the footage. Not just things that would be explained by green screen. But the theory that they're coming up to is that this is an AI-generated version of Vladimir Putin. Think about the ways that can be manipulated. Just saying. International news. After all the stuff we started with, it's crazy to be getting in here now into just Ukraine-related international news. He noted that this is back on December 2nd, that when the United States cut off intelligence, it wasn't a gradual drop-off. It was literally hard cut, which means that Europe is now understanding that they are going to have to stand on their own 2 feet. They're going to have to get the assets in the air to get that intelligence themselves. That said, Europe is not militarily weak. They have more tanks. They've got more planes. They've got more equipment when taken as a whole than even the United States. It's a problem of their willingness to use it. And that's where Europe is having trouble right now. And again, another one here. You see, the national cohesion today is not satisfactory ahead of a war that we will probably arrive at sooner or later. It is already here in Europe, but that's the problem. Europe needs to be on a war footing or Europe will be no longer. There were plans back on December 6th to step up weapons deliveries to Ukraine before Christmas. This appears to have actually happened. This is an old post here, but Ukraine seemed to get a lot of assets right before that time frame, at least from what I've been seeing, especially with some of the counteroffensives happening. Interesting nonetheless. This entire thread, I'm just going to summarize it here. 7 German journalism students tracked Russian crude freighters lurking off the Dutch and German coasts and connected them to drone swarms that have been showing up over military bases in the area. More indications of the hybrid warfare that Russia's carrying out. All right, let's quickly go through the items on the front lines here. One thing that did happen that I caught was really interesting. This is from Crimea. A fully loaded AN-26 on the the taxiway. No, that's the runway right there. On the runway with its engine running, fully loaded, fully crewed. And Ukraine timed a drone strike for that exact moment and took out the plane. Amazing. Pokrovsk, this has been the big thing in the news forever, it seems like. And overall, again, it still appears that eventually Russia will take Pokrovsk. But every time they seem to get a little closer, the Ukrainians seem to push them back a little bit too. According to Sirsky, in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians are increasing the size of their grouping. This is from December 9th, numbering more than 155,000 personnel. This direction accounts for 40 to 50% of all guided aerial bombs that Russia uses on the front. Mirnorad is not encircled. Logistics are complicated, but they are being carried out. There have been some changes since then. Here's the Null Report's latest information here. Let's go get into Pokrovsk. As of this, the latest information, Mirnorad itself is still not fully taken by the Russians. They are continuing to push in this area. They did take this entire section of territory on the 28th, just a few days ago, outside Novo-Ekonomichne. But this still leaves Pokrovsk, part of Pokrovsk itself, still in Ukrainian hands. This is a complicated area right here, and things change by the moment. Pokrovsk itself primarily is in Russian hands. Ukrainian forces appear to be on just the outskirts, on the northern end. And of course, we have this little salient right here. Sorry, this is just how the map works here. Salient right here between Mirnorad and Rivne that continues to be in play. We're watching this as we go. The Russians have tried multiple times. On the 2nd alone, they tried to get a column into the Pokrovsk area, into the Hrishne area. 30 light vehicles intercepted, some destroyed, due to HIMARS strikes and drones. Nordensk remains under Ukrainian control, despite Russian propaganda claims. Again, everything here, there's bits and pieces that are probably true. There's partial truth. It's just how we're going here. I've generally kind of confirmed information from Wargonzo, who generally confirms the things I'm seeing elsewhere on these lines. Let's pop back onto the Null Reports map here. It's kind of the most accurate that I've been able to see so far. This is Kupiansk. You can see here this area is on the 18th, was recaptured by Ukraine and is considered fully under Ukrainian control. It was deep into this area from Russia just a few days prior to that. Another piece of area, Kolesnikivka, was retaken by Ukraine on the 19th of December. I already mentioned this area near Pokrovsk that the Russians took. Here's Huliaipole. They are currently showing the Russians in part of Huliaipole. This area is hot as all get out right now. And this area will not resolve for some time, in my opinion. And that's kind of the front lines. There's not been the sweeping changes that were used to be shown on these maps. things are not simpler, but less varied, perhaps is the best way to say it. From Ukraine control map, as far as today, the 20th Leobart and 14th Chervona Kalina. My pronunciations are way off today, so I apologize. Chervona Kalina Brigade raised their flags in Rodinske, showing they're definitely contesting the settlement. This is the town that the Russians claim they'd already captured. Now, whenever this happens, they like to do, one side throws flags in there, the other side throws flags in there. This is contested territory at this point in time. Overall, again, they're talking about Pokrovsk here. We're going to move on here. This is the Institute for the Study of War's assessment of the current control situation in the area. You can see there's a lot of yellow zone on their map, which is the unknown territories there. They still show Minorod and Pokrovsk still having at least partial Ukrainian presence in both places. This was their assessment as of January 4th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You can see overall there's a lot of things going on. But every time I look at this, things change, but only just a tiny, tiny bit. There's no indications of a collapse happening. But the Russians do tend to take just a little bit of nibbles each time I take another look. And that's the front lines as it is right now. And overall, we're looking at a situation where the Russians keep making big claims, but not coming away with big wins. All right, so let's go into the interesting extras so we can kind of roll things up in a nice, tidy little bow here. This is a fun video, so if you pay close attention here, let me see, get this popped up here. Boop. And pop this up like this. 4 men carrying another man on a stretcher. A drone dropped a grenade. 4 men dropped the stretcher. The man gets off the stretcher and then takes off running as the rest of the soldiers follow along. So they were doing a whole possum routine trying to get the Ukrainians not to attack their little formation there. And once the jig was up, that guy took off like crazy. Gone. And I'm going to finish off today with this short little video here, and I'm going to read as Vladimir Putin speaks back in 2002. As for NATO expansion in general, you know our position on this issue. It remains unchanged. Ukraine is a sovereign state and has the right to choose its own path to ensure its security. I do not see anything special here or anything that could overshadow the relations between Russia and Ukraine. Basically, this is Vladimir Putin in 2002 saying that NATO expansion is not a problem. Ukraine can do what they want. What a difference a couple decades makes. And that's everything for today. Thank you very much for joining me. Glad to have you here. Always glad to have you guys with me. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And it's tough for Ukraine. And I wish them all the best. Good night. Thank you for joining me.